Why would a book praised for wisdom be pushed to the edges? Who decided it belonged near Scripture, but not inside every canon? And what truth were believers afraid to lose or afraid to keep? Tonight, we step into the wisdom of Solomon, a text that sounds ancient, royal, and almost familiar, yet still feels like a locked room in biblical history. It speaks in the voice of Solomon, but many scholars place its composition much later, likely in the Jewish world of Alexandria. It sounds like Israel, but it also speaks fluent Greek thought. It calls the righteous to hope, warns the corrupt of judgment, and paints wisdom not as an idea but as a living presence that moves through history. But here's the thing. The story is not simply that this book was banned. In many Christian traditions, especially within Catholic and Orthodox canons, it was preserved and read as scripture, while in many Protestant traditions, it was placed among the Apocrypha and treated as outside the final rule of faith. So the real question is deeper than rumor. What kind of book can be treasured for centuries, quoted by early believers, and still remain contested at the boundaries of the Bible? Our thesis is simple. The wisdom of Solomon survived because it speaks with moral fire and theological depth, but it remained contested because of authorship, language, and canon history. And our path is clear. We will follow personified wisdom and the destiny of the just, examine immortality and final judgment, trace Alexandria and Greek influence, and finally ask why this book was kept outside canon in some communities while embraced in others. Personified wisdom and the just. In these chapters, wisdom is described almost like breath from God, radiant, pure, and active in the world. The righteous are not promised easy lives. They are mocked, tested, and in some passages treated as though defeated. Yet the text insists their story is not finished at death. This is one reason the book grips modern audiences. It turns suffering into a courtroom where appearances lie and divine justice waits. Second, immortality and final judgment. The book draws a sharp contrast between those who chase power without truth and those who fear God in integrity. Death is presented not as annihilation for the just, but as passage, while the wicked face the weight of their own choices. Some lines feel close to themes later echoed in Christian preaching, which is why readers across centuries kept returning to this text even when its status was debated. Third, Alexandria and Greek influence. This matters because context explains tone. Alexandria was a crossroads of Jewish tradition and Hellenistic philosophy. In that world, a faithful Jewish author could defend covenant faith while using Greek literary style and philosophical language. What looks strange to some readers may actually be the strategy of survival, teaching diaspora communities how to remain loyal to the God of Israel in an intellectual empire, and then the final tension, why it was kept outside canon in some traditions. Questions of original language, questions of authorship, and questions of inherited canon lists shaped the outcome over centuries. This was not one midnight vote. It was a long process, different in different churches, with memory, doctrine, and authority all on the table. So as we begin, hold this close. Not every disputed book is a forbidden lie, and not every accepted text is accepted for simple reasons. Sometimes the boundary lines of Scripture reveal as much about history as they do about belief, and if wisdom still calls in the streets, as Scripture says elsewhere, then the real danger may not be reading too deeply, but refusing to listen when truth sounds unfamiliar. If a book can teach truth, comfort the suffering, and expose injustice, why would some believers still hesitate to call it Scripture? And if that hesitation is not simple fear, what exactly are we looking at, caution or loss? To understand that tension, we begin where the book begins, with wisdom that refuses to stay abstract. In the wisdom of Solomon, Wisdom is not merely a concept to be studied from a distance. Wisdom speaks, guides, judges, and almost seems to move with personal agency. The language rises beyond cold instruction. It sounds like invitation, warning, and presence all at once. For many readers, that is the first surprise. This text does not feel like a footnote to faith. It feels like a living voice. But here is the contrast. In many modern conversations, wisdom means strategy, life hacks, or practical intelligence. In this book, wisdom is moral alignment with God, visible in character, loyalty, endurance, and judgment. The righteous are not called clever. They are called steadfast. They are not promised safety, they are promised vindication, though not always on a human timetable. That difference matters, because it reveals what this book is trying to form inside its audience. When the text describes the just, it does not flatter them with easy triumph. It places them under pressure. They are watched, ridiculed, and tested. Their suffering becomes public evidence in the eyes of opponents who assume suffering proves failure. Have we not seen that pattern in every age, that those who hold to conviction are often treated as naive until the long arc of truth becomes visible? The book confronts that question directly. Its rhetoric around the righteous and the wicked can feel sharp, even severe, yet the sharpness is purposeful. It asks whether power without reverence is wisdom at all, and whether the appearance of success can mask spiritual ruin. This is not armchair philosophy, it is a moral trial scene. On one side, those who trust only what they can control. On the other, those who entrust themselves to divine justice even when outcomes seem delayed. Some descriptions of wisdom in this text have been read as resonant with themes later developed in Christian reflection, especially where divine wisdom is portrayed in exalted terms. We should say this carefully. The book is a Jewish text, shaped in a Jewish world, and should be read on its own terms. Yet the history of interpretation shows that many believers heard in it a theological depth that did not feel disposable. If so many communities treasured it, what made it so compelling? Part of the answer is literary force. The text does not merely argue, it dramatizes moral reality. It turns courtroom logic into spiritual diagnosis. The mockers assume death ends the story of the righteous. The author insists death is not the final verdict. That line of thought points us to the next major tension, because once immortality and judgment enter the frame, the stakes expand beyond politics, reputation, or survival. Before we cross that threshold, hold one pastoral thought. Faithfulness is often measured too quickly. A bruised life is not always a defeated life. Sometimes what looks like silence is simply the delay before God's answer becomes clear. And that leads us forward. If the righteous are not abandoned at death, then what does this book claim about immortality? And why did that claim both attract and unsettle later readers? When the wisdom of Solomon speaks about death, it speaks with startling confidence. The just are said to be in God's hand, and no torment will touch them in the ultimate sense. Their departure is described as peace, even when observers interpret it as ruin. That reversal is one of the most memorable features of the book. It asks us to distrust appearances and to consider that history's first reading is often incomplete. Is this merely poetic comfort or a developed theological claim? Many scholars read these chapters as one of the clearest Second Temple Jewish articulations of personal post-mortem hope in language approaching immortality. We should avoid oversimplifying a complex period. Jewish views of afterlife in antiquity were diverse, and terms do not always map neatly across texts. Still, the signal is clear enough. This book refuses the idea that righteousness ends in oblivion. Now set that beside judgment. The text does not present immortality as generic survival for all moral paths equally. It binds ultimate destiny to moral order. The wicked are not condemned for lacking sophistication. They are condemned for corruption, violence, arrogance, and contempt for the just. In other words, knowledge without reverence is treated as self-deception. What looks like liberation can become a deeper captivity. There is a dark brilliance in that framing. The wicked speak as if pleasure is the only certainty. They treat transience as permission. They weaponize mortality, saying in effect, if life is brief, let appetite rule. The author answers with a severe inversion. Briefness does not erase accountability, it intensifies it. If life is fragile, then moral choices are not less meaningful. They are more meaningful. Some hear in these sections early echoes of themes that later Christian communities would preach with urgency, especially around vindication of the righteous and final accountability. That does not erase the text's Jewish identity. It does explain why early believers could value it deeply while still debating its precise canonical rank in different settings. Influence and canon status are related, but they are not identical. And there is another contrast worth naming. Modern people often think judgment language is primitive fear rhetoric, yet in contexts of oppression, judgment can function as moral hope. For the abused, the exploited, and the voiceless, judgment means evil will not be eternally normalized. It means history has a judge higher than empire. Could that be one reason this book carried such enduring force? At medium pastoral level, we keep this brief but clear. Mercy without truth becomes sentiment. Truth without mercy becomes cruelty. The text pushes us to hold both divine compassion and divine justice without flattening either one. A major puzzle remains. Why does this theology come wrapped in style and vocabulary that feel different from many Hebrew scriptural books? Why does the voice of Israel sound at moments like it is speaking through a Greek philosophical corridor? To answer that, we need to walk into Alexandria. Alexandria was one of the great intellectual crossroads of the ancient Mediterranean, marked by multilingual exchange, philosophical schools, and large Jewish communities in diaspora. In that environment, identity was not abandoned, but negotiated under pressure. How do you remain faithful to ancestral revelation while living inside a dominant Hellenistic world? The Wisdom of Solomon can be read as one answer to that question. Its likely composition in Greek is not a small detail. Language carries assumptions, rhythm, and conceptual tools. When this author writes about wisdom, justice, soul, corruption, and immortality, the rhetoric often reflects both scriptural memory and Hellenistic literary craft. Some readers celebrate that synthesis as strategic faithfulness. Others see it as a potential source of theological ambiguity. Both reactions shaped reception history. Consider what that means practically. A Jewish teacher in diaspora may need to speak in a register intelligible to young listeners educated in Greek categories. If he speaks only in inherited idiom, he risks being unheard. If he imitates the surrounding culture without discernment, he risks dilution. The book stands in that narrow passage between compromise and witness. Is this contamination or contextual mission? When the text retells episodes tied to Israel's memory, especially contrasts between the righteous and idolaters, it does so with rhetorical intensity aimed at moral formation, not detached historiography. That, too, matters for interpretation. If we demand modern academic genres from ancient theological literature, we may misread purpose as error. The author is not writing a neutral archive. He is shaping a people under pressure. This helps explain why later readers disagreed over authority. For some communities, the very ability to carry Israel's faith into Greek expression was evidence of providential relevance. For others, Greek composition and uncertain Solomonic authorship raised caution about canonical boundaries. Here the central dilemma sharpens. Is canonical caution a rejection of truth or a disciplined method for guarding received authority? We should also name the authorship issue with precision. The text presents itself in Solomonic voice, but broad scholarly consensus places its actual composition centuries after Solomon, likely around the late 1st century BCE or early 1st century CE. Ancient, pseudonymous, or voice-adoptive writing was not always viewed by its first audiences as modern fraud categories would imply. Even so, later canon debates increasingly weighed apostolic or prophetic attribution and inherited usage patterns. Then there is the question of scriptural ecosystems. Communities did not all inherit identical canon lists at identical moments. Jewish, Greek-speaking, Latin-speaking, and later Reform-era contexts handled these books through different trajectories. So when people today ask, who banned it? They often imagine a single tribunal and a single date. History looks messier. Reception was layered, regional, and gradual. Yet none of this dissolves the spiritual gravity of the text itself. If anything, it clarifies why the book can be both treasured and contested. Its theological voice proved durable enough to survive centuries of debate. Its historical profile proved complex enough to resist universal placement. That combination is not a contradiction. It is the very heart of our question. And now we arrive at the final chamber. If the content is potent and the reception widespread, why was the wisdom of Solomon kept outside canon in some traditions while embraced in others? First, we need a careful distinction. Outside canon does not always mean forbidden reading. In many contexts, texts now called deuterocanonical or apocryphal were read devotionally, cited morally, or valued liturgically to varying degrees, even when their formal status was disputed. So the popular phrase banned book can create more heat than clarity. The sharper question is canonical rank, not mere existence. Canon formation was not one event, but a long discernment process shaped by worship, teaching, language, and authority structures. Different communities asked overlapping but not identical criteria. Was this text received in inherited liturgical practice? Did it align with the rule of faith? Was it linked to recognized prophetic or apostolic streams? Was its transmission stable across the community's memory? Those are not cynical questions. They are boundary questions every tradition must eventually face. In broad terms, Catholic and Orthodox traditions came to retain wisdom of Solomon within their Old Testament canons, while many Protestant traditions, especially after the Reformation, placed it in the Apocrypha as useful but not fully canonical. That summary should be stated modestly, because historical details vary by confession, region, and period. But the large contour is accurate enough to explain why this debate still lives. Why did Protestants tend toward exclusion? One major factor was appeal to the Hebrew canon as primary Old Testament boundary, along with concerns about certain doctrines and textual lineages associated with deuterocanonical books in late medieval controversies. Why did Catholics and Orthodox retain inclusion? In part because of long-standing ecclesial usage, reception in the Greek and Latin traditions, and conciliar affirmations in their canonical development. Two different instincts are visible here: restoration to perceived earlier boundaries versus consolidation of inherited church reception. So is one side simply faithful and the other compromised? That framing may win arguments, but it often loses understanding. A more truthful account sees competing models of authority at work. One model prioritizes a narrower textual boundary tied to specific historical criteria. Another model prioritizes received ecclesial tradition alongside textual criteria. Both claim to protect faithfulness, both fear drift, both produce consequences. And here the thesis returns with full force. The wisdom of Solomon was not universally contested because it was spiritually empty. It was contested because communities used different maps for determining final scriptural boundaries. Its moral and theological power remained visible even where canonical rank was denied. That is why it remains near the center of Christian memory, while standing at different distances from the center of different canons. What should a modern viewer do with that? Start with intellectual honesty. Do not flatten history into slogans. Do not confuse disagreement with conspiracy. Do not assume that a non-canonical status in your tradition means valueless, and do not assume that devotional usefulness alone settles canonical authority. Mature faith can handle both conviction and complexity. Here is the pastoral edge, gentle but direct. If a text calls you to holiness, justice, humility, and reverence for God, receive the warning and the invitation, even as you remain accountable to your community's doctrine and canon. Discernment is not fear. Discernment is love disciplined by truth. Now look back across our four movements. Personified wisdom and the just taught us that righteousness is often misread before it is vindicated. Immortality and judgment taught us that moral reality outlives appearances. Alexandria and Greek influence taught us that faithful witness can speak across cultures without surrendering its core. Canon controversy taught us that authority is discerned through history, not announced by rumor. So the main dilemma can now be answered without simplification. How can this book shape believers and still sit outside canon in some churches? Because influence and canon are related but distinct. A text may be spiritually luminous and still be weighed differently when traditions define final boundaries of Scripture. That does not erase the tension. It explains it. And maybe that is the final mystery. The boundary itself becomes a teacher. It forces us to ask not only what we read, but how we decide what is read as rule, what is read as witness, and who is entrusted to guard that line. We often want a clean verdict. History gives us a disciplined conversation. Before we move on, ask yourself one plain question. Are we searching this book to win a canon argument, or to be confronted by wisdom that exposes our own compromises? If the second question unsettles us more, perhaps we are finally reading it well. Because in the end, the greatest danger may not be that an ancient text was placed at the edge. The greater danger is that modern hearts place wisdom at the edge, hearing the call, admiring the language, and still refusing obedience. In the next movement, we step from history into decision. If boundaries matter, how should a believer read disputed books responsibly, with conviction, humility, and courage, without either fear or naivety? So where does this leave us? Not with a cheap verdict, and not with a conspiracy slogan. The wisdom of Solomon can be spiritually potent and still canonically disputed, because those are related questions, not identical ones. A text may shape prayer, conscience, and moral imagination, while churches still disagree about whether it belongs inside their final scriptural boundary. That tension does not prove the book is empty. It proves canon was formed through history, language, inheritance, and authority, not through one simple moment. Takeaway 1 is this: personified wisdom and the destiny of the just reveal why the book endured. It speaks to believers who suffer, are misread, and wait for vindication. Takeaway 2. Its vision of immortality and final judgment gave moral weight to history, insisting that evil does not get the last word. Some details about influence pathways into later Christian preaching remain debated, but the thematic resonance is hard to ignore. Takeaway 3. Alexandria and Greek expression help explain both its power and its controversy. What for some looked like faithful translation of covenant truth into a diaspora world, for others raised questions about authorship, language, and canon criteria. That means our main question can be answered without flattening it. The book remained influential because its theology carried real force. It remained contested because different traditions used different methods for defining authoritative scripture. Banned versus accepted is too narrow. The deeper issue is how communities discern authority while trying to protect truth across centuries. And maybe that is the unsettling mirror this episode holds up to us. We often ask whether ancient people drew the line correctly, but we rarely ask where we draw the line now. Do we only trust what fits our tradition's habits? Do we reject difficult voices too quickly? Or do we chase novelty and call it courage? Discernment is harder than suspicion, and humility is harder than certainty. Briefly, one pastoral word. Wisdom is not proved by volume, fear, or performance. Wisdom is proved by reverence, integrity, and obedience over time. If a text, canonical in your church or not, exposes pride and calls you toward holiness, do not ignore that call. Test it carefully, yes, but do not silence truth just because it arrives from an unexpected edge. So as the shadows close on this chapter, keep one thought alive. Perhaps the greatest danger was never that this book stood near the boundary of Scripture. Perhaps the greater danger is that we stand near wisdom, hear it clearly, and still walk away. Watch the next episode, where we enter another disputed text and ask who really feared its message. Take a second, and based on what we uncovered today, answer this in the comments. Do you think the wisdom of Solomon was excluded by error or by canon history? And as always, God bless you.